Johnson looked at his sister Blessing, visibly shocked. Can you see what I'm seeing? Johnson asked. I can't see anything, Blessing replied. Didn't you see the goat at the gate? Johnson pressed. Johnson, leave me alone. Let's just get into the car. Mr. Talabai would soon be here, Blessing said as she hurried towards the car. Still looking shocked, Johnson followed his elder sister into the car. They sat in the car, and a few moments later, Mr. Talabai, their personal driver, entered. I'm sorry, kids. I went to use the toilet. Let's go, Mr. Talabai said as he sat in the driver's seat. Mr. Talabai, were you the one who used the gateman's restroom just now? Johnson asked from the back seat. Yes, my dear. Any problem? I thought I saw a goat, Johnson said, looking amused. There's no goat anywhere, Johnson. It was just your imagination, the driver said, laughing. That's the same thing I told him, Blessing added, giving Johnson a look that said, I told you so. Johnson finally agreed that maybe he didn't see a goat. The driver dropped the children off at school and then drove back home. John and Blessing were the children of the famous power couple on Gately Street. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Coker, owned the only livestock farm in the area, called Aninkere. The farm was very large, with all kinds of animals. It covered many hectares of land, with different sections for each type of animal. They had over 3,000 workers, and customers were always coming to the farm to buy animals. Mrs. Coker, their mother, had a big kitchen where she sold meats and prepared meals. Her kitchen was the most popular in the entire town. However, their parents never had time for Blessing and Johnson. They hired maids and many other workers to care for the children. The influential couple was always busy attending meetings. The children had a personal nanny named Mrs. Annabel Odiime, though she insisted they call her Miss Annabel. Miss Annabel acted like their mother, always taking care of them and ensuring they didn't lack anything. One night, Mr. and Mrs. Coker returned home from an international food conference. They were so tired, they didn't even touch the food left for them on the dining table. As they were heading to their rooms, the children blocked the doors, refusing to let them in. Miss Annabel tried to stop the children from disturbing their parents. My dear Blessing and Johnson, what's the problem? We're so tired. Please allow us to sleep. Whatever you want to discuss, we'll talk about it tomorrow, Mr. Coker said, sounding exhausted. The children refused to move. My children, you heard what your dad said. Please stop disturbing us, their mother added. We'll answer all your questions tomorrow. We won't see you in the morning because you'll have left the house by then, Blessing replied. Okay, then speak with your nanny. She'll buy you whatever you need, their MOM said. Hearing this, the children cried as Miss Annabel led them to their rooms. The next morning, their parents left the house early before the children woke up. All Blessing and Johnson wanted was to spend time with their parents. They often complained about this to Miss Annabel. Miss Annabel, do my MOM and Dad hate us? Johnson would ask. No, don't ever think that, she would reply. Then why don't they like spending time with us? Blessing would ask. They love you very much. Everything they do is to make sure you have food on the table and never suffer, Miss Annabel explained. One Saturday afternoon, as the children were doing their homework in the living room, the cook was busy preparing lunch in the kitchen. Suddenly, Johnson said, I'm so hungry. I want to ask the cook for food. Me too, Blessing agreed. Johnson walked to the kitchen. When he entered, he saw a goat near the sink, and the tap was left running. He screamed and ran back to Blessing, too shocked to speak. What happened? Blessing asked. Still breathing hard, Johnson said, I just saw a goat in the kitchen. Blessing laughed. A goat? You are not serious. Please, come with me. I'm not joking, Johnson pleaded as he dragged his sister to the kitchen. They walked down the hallway, but when they entered the kitchen, the goat was gone. Instead, they saw three people there: Miss Annabel, the cook, and Mr. Talabai. Blessing gave Johnson an angry look. Where's the goat now? She asked. Mr. Talabai was asking the cook for food, and Miss Annabel was requesting food for the children. The cook apologized, saying the food would be ready soon. The nanny threatened to report the cook to the children's parents for the delay. Mr. Talabai noticed the children lingering in the kitchen and asked, What are you looking for? Blessing explained that Johnson came to ask for food because they were hungry, but he said he saw a goat again. Johnson, my boy, there is no goat anywhere, Mr. Talabai said in a reassuring tone. Yes, Johnson, Miss Annabel chimed in. You didn't see any goat. There's nothing like that here. She took both children by the hand and walked them out of the kitchen, saying, Come, let me take you to the dining table. The food will be ready soon. Before leaving, Miss Annabel turned back to the cook and called out, Please make sure the food is ready in a minute. The following Monday during lunch at school, Johnson went to Blessing's classroom. After she had finished eating, he called her outside for a private conversation. Blessing, you don't believe I saw a goat, right? He asked. Johnson, I don't believe you. Why is it only you that keeps seeing this goat? She replied, questioning him. I'm serious, Johnson said earnestly. And I think I know who the goat is. Blessing looked at him with curiosity. Who? It's our driver, Mr. Talabai, Johnson whispered. The other day, I saw the goat, and it came from the same direction he did. And on Saturday, I saw a goat again, and he was right there in the kitchen with Miss Annabel and the cook. Blessing paused for a moment, her tone shifting. That's true, she said, realizing the connection. How do we expose him? Johnson asked. We need to prove it, but we'll need evidence. Blessing nodded in agreement. When we get the evidence, who do we tell? Mom and Dad are never around. We'll tell Miss Annabel, Johnson suggested. She'll talk to Mom and Dad when she sees them. That's true. Blessing agreed. Before they could discuss further, the school bell rang. We'll talk later, Blessing said as they rushed back to their respective class. For weeks, Blessing and Johnson closely monitored Mr. Talabai, determined to uncover the truth. One evening, they noticed he had left his room door slightly ajar. The two crept silently toward the entrance, their hearts racing. To their utter shock, they saw Mr. Talabai transform into a full goat. Standing on the table in the middle of the room, they froze, unable to believe their eyes. Johnson quickly pulled out his phone to capture the moment. Just as he was about to take a picture, Mr. Talabai noticed them. In an instant, he transformed back into a human and walked toward the door. Blessing and Johnson began to fidget, their fear apparent. He smiled at them as if nothing had happened. Blessing, Johnson, what are you both doing here? He asked in a calm tone. Nothing, Blessing replied nervously. We came to play with you. Well, come in then, he said, motioning them inside. Blessing quickly responded. No, we just remembered we have an assignment to finish. While Johnson, still sweating profusely, said nothing. Without another word, the two bolted back to their rooms, slamming the door behind them. They sat down to catch their breaths. After a moment, Johnson spoke. Blessing, I don't understand something. The goat I saw by the toilet looked the same as the one we just saw in his room, but the one in the kitchen, it looked different. Blessing nodded, piecing it together. That means he can turn into different types of goats. We should tell Mom and Dad, but they're always not around, Johnson said, frustration in his voice. Then we'll tell Miss Annabel, Blessing concluded. The next day, after school, the two waited for the right moment when Miss Annabel was alone with them, helping with their assignments. Miss Annabel, we need to tell you a secret, Johnson said, his voice barely above a whisper. What is it? She asked, smiling gently. We don't want you to tell any of the workers in the house, Blessing added quickly. We only want you to tell our parents when they're home, since we barely see them. Miss Annabel looked at them curiously but nodded. All right, I promise I won't tell anyone else. Now, what's the secret? The children then recounted everything. How Johnson first saw the goat near the toilet, the goat in the kitchen, and now the transformation they witnessed in Mr. Talabai's room. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling slightly. When they finished, Miss Annabel let out a long breath and said, I'm not saying I don't believe you, but what you're describing sounds impossible. A man turning into a goat? It's hard to imagine. Seeing the disappointment on their faces, she added quickly, but don't worry. I'll tell your parents exactly what you've told me when they come home. I promise. You trust me, don't you? The children nodded hesitantly. You're safe with me, she assured them. For weeks, Mr. and Mrs. Coker did not come home at all. The children kept asking their nanny if she had told their parents about their concerns, but the parents had not been around. Every day, the kids grew more afraid of Mr. Talabai. Sometimes, they threw tantrums, saying they didn't want to go to school, but the nanny always reassured them and convinced them to go. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Coker finally returned home after a long trip. This time, they brought a guest, Mrs. Badru, a well-known kitchen chef from another city. The three adults sat in the living room, chatting, when the nanny came to welcome them warmly. Mr. and Mrs. Coker asked the nanny to call the children so they could greet the guest. Miss Annabel went to the children's room, where Blessing was helping Johnson with his math homework. Children, your Mom and Dad want you to come and greet their guest, the nanny said as she sat beside them. We're not interested, Blessing replied. They've been gone for months without even checking on us. Now they want us to greet their guest? No way. Please, forgive them, the nanny pleaded. Everything they're doing is for you to have a better life. Come on, stand up and let's go. What about Mr. Talabai? Have you told them yet? Johnson asked. No, They just got back a short while ago. And they came with a guest, Miss Annabel explained. Don't worry, I'll tell them soon. With her encouragement, the children reluctantly agreed and went to greet the guests. A few days later, Miss Annabel requested leave to celebrate her husband's birthday, which was granted. She left the house, and that same day, Mr. Talabai was supposed to take the children to a park in another city for the weekend. Their parents were home that day, so the children went to them and begged not to go. They wailed and pleaded, saying they wanted to stay at home, but their parents refused to listen. Mr. Talabai stood nearby, holding the car keys, waiting for them. Mr. Coker instructed the maids to prepare the children for the trip. As they got ready, the children noticed a small, sinister smirk on the driver's face. They felt something bad was going to happen, but they didn't know what. Without their nanny around to protect them, they felt helpless. Quietly, Blessing and Johnson got into the car, and soon the vehicle drove out of the compound. This time, Mr. Talabai wasn't cheerful or nice as usual. His face was set in a deep frown. Tears streamed down the children's faces as they held each other's hands tightly. When they drove past the event park, the children shouted for him to stop, but he ignored them. They began hitting the car's windows, but the glass was tightly rolled up. The car sped on recklessly, and Mr. Talabai laughed wickedly as he drove. Eventually, he reached a quiet, long road, still driving fiercely, his laughter growing louder and more sinister. Suddenly, he slammed on the brakes and stopped the car. The children wanted to ask why he had stopped, but the anger on his face was enough to silence them. They tried to open the car doors, but they were locked. Mr. Talabai turned around to look at them with a wicked expression. Just then, someone approached the car. It was their nanny, Miss Annabel. Johnson, it's Miss Annabel. Johnson, she's here. Blessing cried, shaking her brother, who hadn't noticed her yet. They quickly wiped their tear-filled faces, feeling a small sense of relief. They thought Miss Annabel's presence would make things better, but their relief was short-lived. Will you keep quiet? Mr. Talabai shouted angrily, his voice echoing in the car. The children froze, terrified. Their eyes turned to Miss Annabel as she climbed into the car, but something was wrong. Her face wasn't warm and reassuring like before. It was cold, almost deadly. Fear gripped them as a chilling thought crossed their minds. Was Miss Annabel part of this? The children panicked and began hitting the car's windscreen again, shouting as loud as they could. "Mom, come and save us. Dad, come and save us. Will you keep quiet?" Miss Annabel shouted in a voice that wasn't hers, a deep, harsh tone they had never heard before. "Your parents are not coming to save you." The car stayed still, and the children's fear grew. Their hands and legs trembled as they sat, too scared to move. Miss Annabel finally spoke, her tone cold and deliberate. "Before anything happens here, you need to know what's going on. Since the two of you are wiser than your ages, it's time for the truth." She paused, then continued. "My real name is Beatrice Phillips," she said, her voice dripping with menace. "And his name," she added, pointing to Mr. Talabai, "is Godwin Phillips." Miss Annabel and Mr. Talabai did not even look back as they spoke. "He's my husband's younger brother," Miss Annabel began. "My husband was a worker at your father's farm company. He was diligent, so diligent that he rarely came home because of his tight schedule at the farm. One day, a disease broke out in one section of the farm. Anthrax, a disease that affects livestock and can infect humans. My husband was exposed to it and fell terribly ill. We begged your father for assistance, but he refused. He could have helped, but he didn't. We spent everything we had trying to save my husband, but it was all in vain. He died, leaving me with nothing. I swore revenge. Godwin, my brother-in-law, joined me in this mission. We sought out a powerful ritual that allowed us to take on new identities, but it came with a condition. We would have to transform into goats, occasionally to maintain the disguise."
Wait, before we continue the story, I am Temille Deebs. I will start to give shoutouts to all people that comment where they are watching from in the next video. Make sure to click on the notification button to know when we upload a new video. Also comment your thoughts on the video and where you are watching from. Back to the story.
She paused, her voice turning colder. "The money your father refused to spend on his workers, he now lavishes on you too. But that won't save you now." The children were trembling, their sweat dripping despite the air conditioner in the car. They held each other tightly as Miss Annabel continued. "The goat you saw by the toilet, Johnson, was my brother-in-law, Godwin. The goat you saw in the kitchen was me. That day, I went to the kitchen to ask the cook for food, but when she opened the tap unknowingly, water splashed on me, and I began to transform into a goat. I barely managed to change back with Godwin's help before the food arrived. When you saw him in the kitchen later, you thought it was the same goat, but you couldn't tell the difference between a male goat and a female one. Blessing, summoning her courage, grabbed her water bottle, ready to pour it on them. But Miss Annabelle's voice cut through sharply. If you pour water on us, he will start the car immediately, and we will all die. Once we turn into goats, we cannot control the car anymore. Do you want that to happen? Spare us. The children cried and pleaded. MOM? Dad, please save us. The two villains laughed wickedly at their distress, but their laughter was suddenly interrupted by the sound of police sirens. Vans surrounded the vehicle, sirens wailing as officers shouted, "You are surrounded. Step out of the vehicle with your hands raised. Do not try anything funny." The evil pair turned to see Mr. and Mrs. Coco running toward the car with the cook. The children sighed with relief, knowing they were finally safe. Miss Annabelle and Mr. Talabai got out of the car slowly, raising their hands in surrender. The police arrested them immediately. Officers opened a back seat door, and the children bolted out, running to their parents and crying heavily. The villains were taken away to face charges in court. At home, after everyone had calmed down, Mr. and Mrs. Coco apologized to their children for neglecting them. They explained how they realized their children were in danger after hearing everything from the cook. The cook revealed how she had seen signs of the villains turning into goats. That day in the kitchen, I accidentally opened the tap and saw them start to transform. I knew their secret, but was too afraid to expose them because I feared they might harm me. After the children left with Mr. Talabai, I finally mustered the courage to tell you everything. The parents tracked the car using a GPS device they had installed, leading the police to intervene just in time. Mr. and Mrs. Coco begged for their children's forgiveness, promising never to neglect them again. Slowly, the children forgave them. From that day on, the family grew closer, vowing to always prioritize their bond over anything else. Moral lessons: parents should always be their children's confidants and friends. Neglecting those who depend on you can lead to unforeseen consequences. Do not repay evil with evil. Forgiveness and understanding pave the way to healing. Please make sure you subscribe and click on the notification button to know when we upload a new video. Please like and share. All parents must see this and learn. Comment your thoughts below in the comment section. Merry Christmas and see you in the next video.